stood in her cramped apartment kitchen, holding the eviction notice with trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of her failures was somehow concentrated in that single document. 3 months. That's how long she had to vacate the modest 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford, Connecticut, the only home her daughter Sophie had ever known. Her vision blurred as she read the formal language, the cold legalese that translated to one simple truth. She was running out of time, money, and options. 7 months. That's how long she'd been unemployed. 7 months since Westbrook Technology, where she'd worked as a marketing coordinator for 5 years, had announced sudden layoffs due to market restructuring. She'd been one of 43 employees let go that dark November morning. At 34 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter and mounting expenses, had felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She'd thought she was secure. She'd thought her job was stable. She'd thought she could provide everything Sophie needed. She'd been wrong about all of it. The apartment's walls seemed to close in as sank onto the worn kitchen chair. Peeling paint decorated the ceiling where water damage had left its mark from last winter's pipe burst. The landlord had never properly fixed it. The linoleum floor was cracked in several places, and the appliances were ancient and temperamental. It wasn't much, this modest apartment that cost $1,400 a month, but it was home. Sophie's bedroom, painted a soft lavender at tremendous expense 3 years ago when had felt prosperous and secure, was where her daughter slept peacefully each night. The living room, with its second-hand furniture and overflowing toy box, was where they built blanket forts and watched cartoons on quiet Saturday mornings. Now it would all be gone. Moved to Sophie's bedroom doorway, watching her daughter sleep. At 3 years old, Sophie was a perfect blend of features and her father's: dark eyes, delicate features, and an infectious laugh that made even the hardest days feel bearable. Sophie was completely oblivious to her mother's crisis. Children lived in the present moment, blissfully unaware of adult complications. That innocence fiercely. She wished she could shield her daughter from the reality that was coming, but she also knew that wasn't possible. Sophie would feel it. The anxiety, the instability, the fear that radiated from her mother's very being. The eviction notice had arrived today, but it was only the latest disaster in an accelerating cascade of failures. Had exhausted her savings 3 months ago. Her unemployment benefits had finally dried up 2 weeks back. She'd applied for over 200 jobs since losing her position at Westbrook. 200 applications, hundreds of interviews that went nowhere, dozens of rejections. The job market was brutally competitive, and at her age, with a gap in employment, companies seemed to view her as a liability rather than an asset. She'd cut expenses to the bone. Netflix was gone. The gym membership canceled. She'd stopped buying new clothes, stopped getting haircuts, stopped all the small luxuries that made life bearable. She'd switched to generic everything at the grocery store. She'd learned to make elaborate meals from cheap rice and beans. She'd negotiated with her daughter's provider, reducing Sophie's attendance to 3 days a week instead of 5, which meant could only interview for jobs during those limited windows. It was a vicious cycle. She couldn't get a job without, but she couldn't afford without a job. But worst of all was the depression. Hadn't anticipated how much the job loss would affect her mentally. She'd always been resilient, capable, strong. She'd raised Sophie as a single mother after her ex-husband moved to Boston to pursue his legal career, content to have minimal contact with his daughter. Had never complained publicly about that. She'd simply adjusted, adapted, and carried on. She was good at carrying on. The depression, however, was something different. It crept in insidiously, disguising itself as fatigue at first. She'd wake up exhausted despite sleeping 10 hours. Everything felt difficult. Getting out of bed, taking a shower, feeding Sophie breakfast, making phone calls for job inquiries. Each task required an enormous effort that left her depleted. Some days, the weight of it was so crushing that she'd sit on the bathroom floor and cry for an hour while Sophie played with her toys in the living room just beyond the door. She'd finally sought help 2 months ago, going to community mental health services where she'd been diagnosed with clinical depression. The therapist had recommended medication, which had reluctantly started. Insurance didn't cover much, she had a bare minimum plan, so therapy sessions were sporadic at best. But the medication helped somewhat. The crushing weight lifted enough that she could function, though never quite at full capacity. Then came the letter from her ex-husband's lawyer 3 weeks ago. Successful trial attorney with a 6-figure salary and prestigious office in downtown Boston, had filed for joint custody of Sophie. His argument was simple and devastating. His recent unemployment and diagnosed depression demonstrated that she was unable to provide stable care for their daughter. He wanted Sophie to spend half her time with him in Boston, half within Hartford. The letter was professional, courteous, and absolutely vicious in its implications. It called her financially irresponsible. It referenced her mental health issues. It questioned her stability and her capability. Had felt something break inside her when she read those words. Her ex-husband had barely been present in Sophie's life. He'd missed countless birthdays, school events, and milestones. He paid child support, $150 a week, but it barely covered diapers and formula. Now, suddenly, he wanted joint custody, was to a woman named Jennifer, a corporate executive with expensive tastes. Suspected this had more to do with tax implications and custody considerations for some future child they might have together than any genuine desire to be involved in Sophie's life. But the courts didn't work on suspicion. They worked on documentation, evidence, and the ability to afford good legal representation. Court-appointed attorney was competent but overworked and clearly unimpressed by her case. "We'll argue your point," he'd said without enthusiasm, "but your employment situation is concerning. You'll need to demonstrate stability." Stability, the word had become a joke in life. Tomorrow was the custody hearing. Tomorrow she would sit in a courtroom and fight for her daughter, not because was a bad father but because she was apparently not good enough as a mother, not financially stable enough, not mentally healthy enough, not enough, period. Returned to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of black coffee. It was nearly midnight. She had a folder of documents prepared for tomorrow. Her job search efforts, her therapy records, her bank statements showing she was trying to manage financially despite impossible circumstances. None of it felt like enough. Nothing ever felt like enough anymore. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the eviction notice again, then at her laptop which displayed her calendar. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., her future would be decided. Tomorrow, a judge would look at her unemployment, her depression, her financial instability, and her inadequate apartment, and determine whether she was worthy of keeping her own daughter. Set her alarm for 4 a.m. She knew she wouldn't sleep. Some nights sleep simply wasn't possible, hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the entire night rehearsing her testimony, packing her apartment, and checking the clock obsessively. By 6 a.m., she'd given up pretending sleep was possible. She showered, stood in front of her closet for 30 minutes trying to decide what to wear, and finally selected a navy blue blazer she'd purchased 3 years ago for a work conference. It was slightly too tight now. She'd lost weight since the job loss, stress eating replaced with stress-induced loss of appetite. But it looked professional. It looked competent. It looked like the kind of woman a judge might believe was capable of caring for a child. She woke Sophie gently at 7 a.m., explaining that they had a special appointment. 3-year-olds didn't need to understand the gravity of custody hearings. She simply said they were going to see a judge, using the same tone she'd used discussing a visit to the pediatrician. Sophie, still groggy and confused, allowed herself to be dressed in a pink flowered dress that had ironed the night before. She twisted Sophie's dark hair into 2 small pigtails, tied with pink ribbons. Her daughter looked beautiful, innocent, perfect. Wondered if the judge would care about such things. Would Sophie's appearance influence his decision? She hated that she was even considering such tactics, but desperation made one contemplate everything. They arrived at the Hartford County Courthouse at 8:30 a.m. The building was imposing, gray stone and high arches that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort, held Sophie's hand tightly as they passed through security. The metal detectors and security guards made everything feel official, serious, consequential. Sophie looked around with wide, curious eyes, fascinated by the institutional surroundings. Her daughter's inability to recognize danger. The courthouse hallway was crowded with attorneys in expensive suits, their leather briefcases and confident postures marking them as professionals. Court-appointed attorney David was waiting near the courtroom entrance. He was competent but exhausted, clearly juggling multiple cases simultaneously. He'd met with only twice, both meetings lasting less than an hour each. He'd reviewed her documents quickly, nodding occasionally but offering little encouragement. "Let's go over your testimony one more time," David said, gesturing toward a quiet corner. They reviewed the same points they'd discussed before. Her job search efforts, the 200 applications she'd submitted, the interviews she'd attended, her ongoing therapy, her financial management despite reduced circumstances. David coached her on how to answer questions, emphasizing that she should keep responses brief, never volunteer additional information, and maintain composure regardless of how aggressively opposing counsel attacked her credibility. "The other side will try to provoke you," David explained. "They want you angry or tearful. Either emotion undermines your testimony. Stay calm, stay factual. You're a reasonable, competent person who faced economic hardship. That's not a character flaw." Nodded though his words felt hollow. She wasn't a reasonable person right now. She was terrified. Her hands shook as she gripped Sophie's hand. At 9:15 a.m., they entered the courtroom. It was larger than had anticipated, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that made everything feel solemn and official. Judge Robert Harrison sat elevated behind the bench, reviewing documents with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. He was in his 60s, with gray hair and a stern demeanor that had been described too as difficult to read but fair. Fair didn't mean favorable. Fair just meant he followed the law, and the law seemed to favor fathers with money and stability over mothers with depression and unemployment. His ex-husband sat at the opposing counsel's table looking impeccably groomed. He wore a three-piece suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent. His lawyer, a sharp-featured woman was known for winning custody cases. She was aggressive, thorough, and merciless. Had researched her online late last night. Win rate was 87%. Sophie sat beside on a specially arranged cushion, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor. She was already bored, playing with her fingers and looking around at the strange environment. Squeezed her daughter's hand gently, a silent reminder to be still. Judge Harrison began by outlining the case. Custodial parent, seeking to maintain full custody of Sophie, age 3 years. Non-custodial parent with visitation rights, seeking expanded custody due to concerns regarding the custodial parent's fitness. The judge's tone was neutral, bureaucratic, completely devoid of emotion. His testimony began at 9:45 a.m. David guided her through questions about her employment history, her efforts to find new work, her financial management, and her relationship with Sophie. She answered each question carefully, demonstrating her competence and her commitment. Yes, she'd applied to 200 jobs. Yes, she was still searching actively. Yes, she'd received therapy for depression. No, she'd never missed a support payment. No, she'd never endangered Sophie. No, she'd never left Sophie unsupervised or in unsafe conditions. For the first hour, it seemed manageable. Felt herself settling into the rhythm of testimony, her anxiety gradually decreasing as she demonstrated her reasonableness and capability. Then began her cross-examination, and everything changed. "Ms. began, her voice sharp and cutting. "You were terminated from your position at Westbrook Technology, correct? The company underwent restructuring. Multiple employees were laid off." "That's not what I asked. Were you terminated?" "Yes, but..." "And in the 7 months since your termination, you've been unable to secure new employment." I've been actively searching. The job market is difficult. 7 months is a long time to remain unemployed, isn't it? Many people would have found work by now. Felt anger rising in her chest. David had warned her about this, but the accusatory tone still stung. I've applied to hundreds of positions. The economy is challenging, and I'm competing against candidates who were never laid off. You've been diagnosed with clinical depression, correct? Interrupted, not waiting for to finish her response. Yes, I sought help when I was struggling. And you're currently taking psychiatric medication. Antidepressants, yes, my therapist recommended. So you're taking psychiatric medication and unemployed. Yet you believe you're the appropriate primary caregiver for a 3-year-old child. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Sophie shifted uncomfortably beside, sensing her mother's distress. Hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the witness stand. My depression resulted from job loss, not the other way around, said carefully. I sought help. I'm managing it appropriately. It doesn't affect my ability to love or care for my daughter. Let's discuss your living situation, continued relentlessly. You're currently residing in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood characterized by higher crime rates, correct? I live in a safe neighborhood, my apartment. Your apartment has documented maintenance issues, doesn't it? A landlord complaint was filed regarding mold in the bathroom and water damage in the kitchen area. How did she know that? His mouth went dry. She'd never mentioned the apartment's condition to anyone. Must have sent an investigator, someone who'd inspected her home, documented its flaws, built a case against her. The landlord is addressing those issues. And your current financial situation. You have approximately $800 in your checking account, is that correct? Felt her face flush. David hadn't prepared her for this level of detailed financial investigation. The opposing counsel had clearly obtained her bank records somehow. $800. That was the sum total of her financial security, her cushion against complete disaster. Stating it aloud in a courtroom made it sound even more pathetic than she'd already felt. I'm managing limited resources while seeking employment, said, her voice smaller now. Managing. That's one word for it, said. Others might call it struggling. Others might question whether a struggling, depressed, unemployed mother in a deteriorating apartment can adequately provide for a child's needs. Wouldn't you agree that stability is important for young children? Judge Harrison didn't object. He simply watched, his expression unchanging. Realized the judge's neutrality wasn't actually neutral. It was cold, skeptical, judgmental. Every word spoke seemed to carry weight with him. Every admission made seemed to pile another brick onto the wall being constructed against her. By noon felt completely defeated, had systematically dismantled her credibility, weaponized her struggles, and painted a portrait of inadequacy. Had answered every question truthfully, but truth seemed irrelevant in this context. Facts could be arranged to suggest anything. Poverty could be presented as irresponsibility. Depression could be portrayed as instability. Job loss became evidence of incompetence. Sophie was increasingly restless, could feel her daughter's anxiety mirroring her own. When Judge Harrison announced a lunch break at 12:30, felt both relief and dread. Relief that the testimony was paused. Dread that the afternoon would bring more attacks, more ammunition used against her. As they walked toward the courthouse hallway, held Sophie close, wondering if this was what losing a child felt like. This hollow, crushing sensation that everything was already decided, that she'd already lost before the hearing even truly began. Sat in the courthouse cafeteria, pushing a sad turkey sandwich around her plate without actually eating. She'd purchased it mechanically from the vending machines, her mind elsewhere entirely. Sophie sat beside her, munching on goldfish crackers from a small bag kept in her purse for emergencies like this. Around them, other people moved through the cafeteria with purpose, lawyers consulting with clients, judges grabbing quick lunches, court administrators conducting official business. Everyone seemed to belong here except everyone else looked competent, assured, like they possessed the stability and resources this environment demanded. David sat across from them, reviewing his notes for the afternoon session. He'd been giving encouragement, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd reviewed similar cases before. He knew how this story typically ended. An unemployed, depressed mother, a financially secure father. The judge would likely rule for expanded custody, maybe even shared custody. Would lose half her time with Sophie. Her daughter would be shuttled between Hartford and Boston. The life they'd built together, small as it was, would be fractured. The afternoon will focus on character witnesses and financial capacity, David explained, though had heard this before. Your ex-husband will testify about his resources, his home setup for Sophie, his stability. We'll try to emphasize that money isn't everything, that emotional connection matters more than financial resources. But honestly, he trailed off, not finishing the sentence. He didn't need to. His expression said it all. Picked at her sandwich, her stomach in knots. She was unable to eat. She was unable to think about anything except the afternoon session and how it would destroy her world. Sophie, oblivious to the stakes, asked for more crackers, gave them to her, grateful for the distraction of her daughter's simple needs. At 1:45 p.m., they returned to the courtroom. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows created long shadows across the floor. Notice the light as she entered, how beautiful it was, how indifferent to human suffering. The sun would continue shining whether she lost her daughter or not. The courtroom would continue functioning. The world would continue turning. Her personal devastation would register as merely one case among thousands. Judge Harrison was already at the bench, reviewing documents. Took her seat at the plaintiff's table, Sophie settling beside her with renewed restlessness. The afternoon was going to be long, and Sophie's patience was wearing thin. Wished she could take her daughter back to the apartment, back to safety and familiarity, away from this cold institutional space that seemed designed to determine the value of human beings. At precisely 2 p.m., Judge Harrison called the afternoon session to order. Stood immediately, ready to call her first witness. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors opened and an officer entered. Tension shifted briefly. She hadn't been expecting additional witnesses, but she assumed it was just another procedural matter. Officer was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in an official police uniform despite not being part of the typical court proceedings. He seemed slightly nervous, as if uncertain about his place in this legal environment. Following behind him, on a leather leash, was K9 Buddy. His breath caught. She'd read about the courthouse support dog program in an article last month, but had never expected to see it in operation. The golden retriever was magnificent. His coat gleamed under the fluorescent courtroom lights, and he moved with a calm confidence that seemed almost meditative. Buddy wore an official vest indicating his role as a certified emotional support animal. He was beautiful in a way that transcended his physical appearance. There was something inherently calming about his presence, something that suggested safety and unconditional acceptance. Judge Harrison looked up from his documents. For the first time that day, his stern expression shifted slightly. "Officer," he said, "I recall approving your request to bring K9 Buddy for potential witness support this afternoon. I believe you mentioned some anxious witnesses." "Yes, Your Honor," Officer replied respectfully. "We have several witnesses who were expressing anxiety about testimony. We thought Buddy's presence might help ease some of that stress, if that remains acceptable." Judge Harrison nodded. "That's acceptable. Please position him in the corner area near the bench, where he won't disrupt proceedings but where witnesses can see him if needed." Officer guided Buddy to the designated area. The dog moved gracefully, perfectly trained, and settled onto a cushioned bed positioned near the judge's elevated bench. His intelligent brown eyes surveyed the courtroom with calm awareness. Buddy had clearly been in courtrooms before. He understood the environment, the need for quiet decorum, the emotional gravity of legal proceedings. barely registered what was happening. Her mind was still trapped in the devastation of the morning testimony. She was still replaying attacks, still feeling the weight of her own inadequacy. She didn't fully process the dog's arrival until she heard a small gasp from beside her. Sophie had seen Buddy. The transformation in her daughter was instantaneous and profound. Sophie's entire body went rigid with excitement. Her eyes widened impossibly large, and she sat up, all traces of boredom and restlessness vanishing instantly. She'd been slumping in her chair, tired and overstimulated by the courtroom environment. Suddenly, she was alert, engaged, completely mesmerized. "Mama," Sophie whispered urgently, tugging at sleeve. "Mama, look, dog." Glanced down at her daughter, seeing the pure, uncomplicated joy radiating from her small face. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen on Sophie's face in months. Not the forced smiles prompted with exhausted bedtime stories. Not the dutiful smiles Sophie produced when asked her to smile for the camera. This was something real, authentic excitement, wonder, the simple happiness a child feels discovering something beautiful in a frightening world. His eyes welled with tears. She placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, and her daughter leaned against her, both of them transfixed by the golden retriever settling into his cushioned bed across the room. Buddy, perhaps sensing the child's emotional need, turned his head and looked directly at Sophie. His brown eyes met hers with what seemed like recognition and understanding. The dog's tail wagged slowly, deliberately, as if he understood the delicate emotional dynamics of the courtroom and was offering comfort with every movement. Sophie's hand reached out unconsciously, as if drawn toward the dog by an invisible thread, held her back gently, aware that they couldn't disturb the proceedings. But Sophie's focus remained entirely on Buddy. The dog had become the only thing in existence that mattered to her. The courtroom, the judge, the tension, all of it faded into irrelevance. There was only Buddy and the inexplicable comfort his presence provided. Realized something in that moment. She'd spent the entire morning defending her competence as a parent, reciting her achievements and efforts. She tried to prove her worth through credentials and documentation, but watching Sophie's face as she gazed at Buddy understood that none of those arguments mattered. What mattered was this: her daughter felt safe enough to smile, to experience joy, to trust. That was the real evidence of parenting success, not employment status, not financial resources, not the absence of depression. Just this: a child's unconditional trust and capacity for happiness in her mother's presence. The afternoon session was about to become something neither the judge nor the opposing counsel had anticipated. Something that would transcend legal arguments and documented evidence. Something that would speak to a deeper truth about love, attachment, and what truly mattered in a child's life. As watched Sophie watching Buddy, she felt something shift inside her chest. Perhaps there was hope yet. Perhaps love, demonstrated so simply and clearly, might actually matter in a courtroom after all. The courtroom had settled into its procedural rhythm. Was calling her first afternoon witness, a financial advisor who would testify to superior financial resources and stability. The expert was explaining investment portfolios and property values, documentation of stability to provide substantial resources for Sophie's upbringing. It was damaging testimony, the kind that painted a picture of a child who could have everything money could provide if only she lived with her father instead of her struggling mother. But barely heard the testimony. She was focused entirely on Sophie, who remained transfixed by Buddy. Her daughter's attention never wavered from the golden retriever across the courtroom. Every few moments, Sophie would lean toward Buddy, then remember she needed to remain still and would settle back into her seat. But her small body vibrated with barely contained excitement. Realized she'd never seen Sophie this engaged, this happy, despite the austere and frightening courtroom setting. Judge Harrison droned through procedural questions, his expression returning to its characteristic coldness as the afternoon wore on. The financial testimony was extensive and detailed, carefully constructed to emphasize everything lacked. Numbers were cited, annual income, property values, investment portfolios, educational resources available through s network. Each figure was another nail in s coffin, another reason a logical judge might decide that Sophie would be better served by her father's financial security. Felt her hope flickering again. She'd allowed herself to imagine for a few moments after Buddy arrived that something might change. But now, watching the relentless march of evidence against her, she understood that a dog's presence, however comforting, couldn't compete with documented financial superiority. The law operated on facts and figures. Love didn't appear in tax returns. Sophie tugged at sleeve again. "Mama," she whispered urgently, so quietly that only could hear. "Mama, the dog, can I go see?" Shook her head gently, whispering back, "We have to stay here, sweetie. We can't disturb the judge." Sophie's disappointment was palpable. She slumped slightly in her chair, her eyes still fixed on Buddy. The golden retriever seemed to sense Sophie's longing. He shifted slightly on his cushioned bed, turning his body more toward where Sophie sat. His tail wagged slowly, deliberately, a gentle invitation issued silently across the courtroom's charged space. The financial testimony concluded at 3:45 p.m. Judge Harrison announced a 15-minute recess. Most of the courtroom occupants stood, stretching, moving around. This was the moment when Officer typically would have led Buddy out of the courtroom, returning only when needed for actual witness support. But something unusual happened. Officer, observing Sophie's obvious distress and emotional connection to Buddy, approached the judge's bench during the recess. Couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched as gestured toward Sophie, explaining something to Judge Harrison. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but he nodded slightly, then turned and looked toward Sophie, making eye contact with across the courtroom. "Mrs. called out, "Would Sophie like to say hello to Buddy, just for a moment?" His heart stopped. Did she have permission? Was this appropriate? She looked uncertainly at Judge Harrison, who was watching the interaction with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. He didn't object. That, realized, was permission. Sophie's entire face lit up. She turned to with sudden hope blazing in her eyes. "Can I, Mama, can I?" "Yes," said her voice thick with emotion. "Let's go say hello to the dog." And Sophie stood up from their seats and walked across the courtroom toward Officer and Buddy. The courtroom fell silent, everyone watching the scene unfold. This was unusual, unorthodox. Dogs didn't typically interact with children during courtroom proceedings. But Officer had made a judgment call, and Judge Harrison had allowed it. As they approached, Buddy stood from his cushioned bed. The dog was even more impressive up close, larger than he'd appeared from a distance, but his demeanor remained gentle and calm. His entire focus centered on Sophie, as if the child were the only being in the universe that mattered. Sophie stepped forward carefully, her small hand extended tentatively. "Hi, dog," she said shyly, her earlier enthusiasm tempered by actual proximity to the large animal. Buddy lowered his massive head slowly, deliberately, until it was level with Sophie's small hand. He didn't jump or lick or display typical puppy enthusiasm. Instead, he simply presented himself as available for gentle contact. His brown eyes locked onto Sophie's, and something profound seemed to pass between them, a moment of genuine connection that transcended species and circumstance. Sophie's tiny fingers gently touched Buddy's forehead. Her small palm stroked down his long snout. She giggled, that pure, uninhibited sound of childhood joy that realized she hadn't heard in far too long. Buddy's tail wagged slowly, responding to the child's touch with perfect gentleness. "You're a good boy," Sophie said, her voice filled with wonder. "Good boy, so good." The entire courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the aggressive opposing counsel sat frozen watching the interaction. Felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't know if they were from joy or from the intensity of the moment. She was witnessing something sacred, something that no legal argument could touch. The pure connection between a child and an animal, the offering and acceptance of unconditional love. Sophie continued to pet Buddy, her face radiant with happiness. Then, suddenly, she turned to look at her mother while still touching the dog. Her small hand remained on Buddy's head, but her eyes found. In that moment, something crystallized, a realization, a declaration, a statement of fundamental truth. Sophie pointed at Buddy with her other hand, still keeping contact with him, and said with absolute clarity, "Good boy." The words echoed through the silent courtroom, but Sophie wasn't quite finished. She glanced between Buddy and her mother and then added the second word, turning her gaze fully to with love blazing from her 3-year-old eyes. "Mama." The courtroom erupted. Not in noise, no one shouted or spoke, but in gasps, in the sudden sound of people drawing breath simultaneously. Felt her knees weaken. Sophie had just called her mother good boy, or rather, she'd identified the dog as good and then identified her mother as mama, creating a perfect, innocent, devastating statement of truth. Her mama was her good one, her safe one, her source of comfort and love. Judge Harrison stood abruptly from his bench, his stern composure completely shattered. He removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes and realized, with a shock, that the judge was crying. Actual tears were streaming down the face of this man who had seemed made of stone all morning. When Judge Harrison finally spoke, his voice was thick and trembling. "Officer, thank you for that wisdom. I believe we may need to take a recess while I collect myself." He looked directly at, and his eyes held a message that transcended words. In that glance, saw understanding, recognition, and a fundamental shift in perspective. The judge had just witnessed what she'd known all along, that Sophie's love for her mother was as real and pure as the dog's unconditional acceptance. No legal argument could dispute it. No financial advantage could diminish it. No depression or unemployment could erase it. Sophie reached up and took his hand and scooped her daughter into her arms, holding her close as both of them looked back at Buddy. The dog's tail continued to wag, as if he understood he'd just performed a miracle. Judge Robert Harrison sat alone in his chambers, the door closed firmly behind him. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes, trying to compose himself. In 37 years on the bench, he had prided himself on maintaining judicial objectivity, emotional detachment, and unwavering adherence to legal precedent. He had witnessed thousands of cases, made countless decisions that affected people's lives profoundly, and had learned to separate human emotion from legal reasoning. It was a necessary skill for a judge, the ability to set aside one's personal feelings and apply the law fairly and consistently. But 37 years of judicial training had just been undone by a 3-year-old girl and a golden retriever. Judge Harrison stood and walked to the window of his chambers, looking out over Hartford's downtown landscape. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift, casting longer shadows across the streets below. He thought about Sophie's face as she petted Buddy, the pure, uncomplicated joy radiating from her small features. He thought about her words, "good boy," Mama delivered with such devastating innocence and clarity. He thought about how his face had transformed when her daughter called her Mama, identifying her as the source of safety and love. For the first time in decades, Judge Harrison questioned whether his approach to family law was correct. He'd spent his entire career believing that custody decisions should be based on objective criteria: financial stability, employment status, mental health history, living conditions, educational resources. These were measurable, comparable factors that could be weighed and balanced according to legal standards. He had reviewed hundreds of custody cases through that analytical lens. He had made decisions that prioritized financial security and material resources, believing those factors were most important for a child's. But what had he just witnessed? A child clearly thriving emotionally under her mother's care. A child secure enough to experience joy, to trust, to engage openly with others. A child who, when asked to identify her source of safety and comfort, pointed to her mother without hesitation or confusion. All of those developmental markers suggested that, despite her unemployment and depression, was providing her daughter with the most important thing a child needs: secure attachment and unconditional love. Judge Harrison returned to his desk and pulled out Sophie's case file. He reviewed the documentation again: job search efforts, her therapy records, her bank statements. He'd read these documents that morning with a skeptical eye, viewing them as evidence of inadequacy. Now, reading them again, he saw something different. He saw a woman actively seeking employment. He saw a woman responsibly pursuing mental health treatment. He saw a woman carefully managing limited resources. He saw evidence of effort, commitment, and responsibility under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The phone on his desk buzzed. His administrative assistant's voice came through. "Your Honor, the attorneys are requesting to know when court will resume." Judge Harrison looked at the clock. He'd been in chambers for 20 minutes. The courtroom was full of people waiting for him to return, waiting for him to continue with the proceeding, waiting for him to help decide Sophie's future. "Tell them I'll be resuming in 5 minutes," he said. "And I'd like to speak with officer before we resume. Have him come to my chambers." 5 minutes later, officer stood in Judge Harrison's private office, K9 Buddy's leash in his hand. The dog sat calmly at his side, seemingly unaware of the profound impact he just had on a custody hearing. "Officer," Judge Harrison began, "I want to thank you for bringing K9 Buddy to court today. What you did, allowing that child to interact with the dog, that was not standard procedure. That was a judgment call." Nodded, his expression serious. "Your Honor, I've worked with emotional support dogs for 15 years. I've seen them help countless traumatized witnesses, anxious children, and distressed individuals. But what I witnessed today," he paused, searching for words. "That little girl needed to know that safety existed in this courtroom, that love existed in this frightening place. Buddy provided that for her, and in doing so, he showed everyone here something true about her relationship with her mother." Judge Harrison felt something shift in his chest. "What you're saying is that the dog's presence allowed the truth to emerge more clearly than any testimony could have." "Exactly, Your Honor. Legal testimony is filtered through language, interpretation, bias. But a child's genuine emotional response to an animal, that's unfiltered truth. That's what the child actually feels, stripped of all the defensive mechanisms adults develop." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "You've given me a great deal to consider, officer. Thank you." When Buddy left his chambers, Judge Harrison sat for another moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he prepared to return to the courtroom, but not for a typical proceeding. He was going to do something that was highly unusual, perhaps even unprecedented in his courtroom. At 4:30 p.m., Judge Harrison took his seat at the bench and called the court back into session. The courtroom filled with anticipation. Everyone knew something significant had shifted. The judge's previous stern demeanor was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful, more human, more genuinely judicial in the best sense of the word. "Before we proceed further," Judge Harrison announced, "I need to make some observations about what I witnessed during the recess." Stood immediately. "Your Honor, if I may object to any statements made outside the record." Judge Harrison raised his hand, silencing her. "Counsel, I'm not making statements outside the legal record. I'm making observations about evidence that occurred in open court, witnessed by all present. Sophie's interaction with K9 Buddy is relevant evidence regarding her emotional and her attachment patterns." He turned his attention to Sophie, who sat at the plaintiff's table. Sophie was nestled against her mother, looking small and vulnerable. His arm was around her daughter, protective and loving. "I have reviewed family law extensively," Judge Harrison continued, his voice steady but emotional. "I have studied attachment theory, developmental psychology, and the criteria for determining what serves children's best interests. But I must acknowledge that this afternoon, I witnessed something that no peer-reviewed study could have explained more clearly than the child herself." He paused, his gaze fixed on Sophie. That little girl demonstrated through her actions and her words that she feels secure, loved, and safe in her mother's care. She demonstrated the ability to experience joy despite being in an intimidating environment. She demonstrated trust. These are not indicators of maternal inadequacy. These are indicators of secure attachment and healthy emotional development. Judge Harrison's voice became thicker with emotion. In my years on this bench, I have made decisions based on financial metrics, employment status, and material resources. I have operated under the assumption that these factors are primary determinants of a child's, but I now recognize that I may have been prioritizing the wrong criteria. He removed his glasses again and could see that his eyes glistened with unshed tears. Love, demonstrated so clearly this afternoon, cannot be measured in a financial statement. It cannot be documented in employment records. It cannot be assessed through psychiatric diagnoses. And yet, it is the foundation upon which healthy human development is built. I believe I have lost sight of that truth in my pursuit of objective legal standards. Judge Harrison looked directly at for the first time that afternoon. The petitioner argues that joint custody would benefit the child through expanded financial resources and educational opportunities. The evidence regarding these resources is clear and documented. However, the evidence regarding this child's actual emotional needs is equally clear. Sophie is securely attached to her mother. Disrupting that primary attachment would not serve her best interests, regardless of the financial advantages offered. The opposing counsel looked stunned, stood as if to object, but Judge Harrison continued speaking, overriding any interruption. I am going to take a different approach to this case than I have traditionally taken. I am going to prioritize the child's demonstrated emotional security and attachment patterns alongside the documentation of material resources. And based on all available evidence, including what I witnessed this afternoon, I believe is providing appropriate care for her daughter. Felt hope blooming in her chest, but she remained silent, afraid to interrupt, afraid to break the spell of this moment. We will take a brief recess, Judge Harrison announced. I will review all testimony from this morning and all evidence presented this afternoon. I will consider how to weight the various factors appropriately. I will return with my ruling at 5:30 p.m. As the judge left the bench, held Sophie close. She caught Officer's eye across the courtroom and saw him nod slightly, a gesture of understanding and support. Buddy wagged his tail gently, as if affirming that something right had occurred, something true had been recognized. For the first time that day, allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love might actually matter in a courtroom after all. The courtroom was packed when Judge Harrison returned at 5:30 p.m. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through courthouse staff, perhaps through the attorneys who had told their associates about the unusual turn of events. Whatever the cause, every seat was filled, and people stood along the back walls, observers curious about what kind of decision would emerge from such a dramatic afternoon. Sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding so forcefully she could hear it in her ears. Sophie was nestled against her, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. David had briefed her during the recess. He was cautiously optimistic. Judge Harrison's statements before the recess had been overwhelmingly positive toward their case, but judicial decisions were unpredictable, and nothing was certain until the gavel came down. Sat at the opposing counsel's table, her sharp features tense. She was reviewing her notes, preparing arguments for appeal should the ruling go against her client. Had no doubt that would appeal if necessary. Wealthy clients didn't accept unfavorable custody decisions without fighting them through every available legal channel. Sat beside his attorney, his confident posture slightly diminished. For the first time, he seemed uncertain about the outcome. Wondered what he was thinking, whether he understood that his financial resources, however substantial, might not be enough to overcome what his daughter had demonstrated about her emotional security with her mother. Judge Harrison took his seat at the bench at precisely 5:30 p.m. He had his ruling written before him, several pages of legal documentation. He adjusted his glasses, looked out over the courtroom, and began to speak. This case has presented the court with questions that go to the very heart of what it means to make decisions in a child's best interest. Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction. The petitioner has presented substantial documentation regarding his financial resources, his stable employment, and his capacity to provide material advantages for the child, Sophie. This documentation is clear, well-organized, and demonstrates genuine financial capability. Stomach clenched, he was laying out the opposing case first, the traditional approach in judicial rulings. It made sense procedurally, but it made her anxious nonetheless. However, Judge Harrison continued, the law regarding custody decisions requires that the court prioritize the best interests of the child above all other considerations. Financial resources, while important, are not the primary determinant of a child's. Emotional security, stable attachment, and demonstrated parental capability are equally, if not more, significant factors. He began reading from his written decision. The court finds that has consistently demonstrated competent parenting despite significant personal and economic challenges. The evidence shows that Mrs. has actively sought employment, participated in mental health treatment, and maintained a safe, stable home environment for her daughter. The court notes that seeking therapeutic support indicates responsibility and self-awareness, not inadequacy. Felt tears beginning to form. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court acknowledges that in the current economic climate, job loss due to company restructuring does not reflect negatively on an individual's work ethic, capability, or character. Thousands of qualified, capable individuals have experienced similar employment disruptions. The petitioner's argument that unemployment indicates parental inadequacy is hereby rejected as unfounded. Judge Harrison removed his glasses briefly, then replaced them before continuing. The court has observed the interaction between Sophie and the courtroom support dog this afternoon. Specifically, the court observed the child's clear emotional attachment to her mother, her demonstration of secure attachment behaviors, and her identification of her mother as her primary source of safety and comfort. These observations provide strong evidence that Sophie is emotionally healthy and secure in her mother's care. He paused meaningfully. The court recognizes that children develop secure attachments to parents through consistent, loving care. The petitioner has argued that expanded paternal involvement would benefit the child. However, the court notes that secure attachment develops with primary caregivers through ongoing, consistent interaction. Disrupting Sophie's existing secure attachment to her mother could cause emotional harm to the child, harm that would not be offset by improved financial circumstances. Judge Harrison adjusted his papers and continued with his formal legal reasoning. In accordance with Connecticut General Statute Section 46B-56, the court must determine custody arrangements that serve the best interests of the child. The statute requires consideration of the factors including, but not limited to, the capacity and disposition of each parent to care for the child, the willingness of each parent to be involved in the child's life, the interaction and relationship between the child and each parent, and the ability of each parent to provide adequate food, clothing, medical care, and other material necessities. He looked directly at, applying these factors to the present case, has demonstrated both the capacity and disposition to care for Sophie. Mrs. has prioritized her daughter's needs despite personal hardship. Mrs. has maintained active involvement in Sophie's daily life. Mrs. has demonstrated secure attachment with her daughter. While Mrs. faces temporary financial constraints, she has demonstrated responsibility in managing limited resources and actively seeking to improve her employment situation. He then turned his gaze toward, while the petitioner possesses superior financial resources, financial capacity alone is insufficient to warrant modification of existing custody arrangements, when doing so would disrupt a child's secure attachment to a capable, loving primary caregiver. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his voice becoming even more emphatic. It is therefore the order of this court that full custody of Sophie remains with her mother. The petitioner is granted supervised visitation rights as follows: every other weekend, Saturday noon through Sunday 6 p.m., with visitation to occur in Hartford to minimize disruption to the child's routine. Additionally, the petitioner shall maintain telephone contact with Sophie twice weekly, on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 p.m. Felt her body go limp with relief and shock. She'd won. She'd actually won. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, the court recommends that any visitation arrangements be managed through a co-parenting coordinator to ensure that the child's best interests are prioritized and that communication between parents remains civil and child-focused. The court also recommends that the petitioner engage in parenting classes focused on attachment theory and child development to better understand the child's emotional needs. He looked directly at his lawyer. Counsel is advised that any future petitions for custody modification will be scrutinized carefully. The court has ruled based on clear evidence of secure attachment and capable parenting. The burden of proof for modifying this arrangement would be substantial and would require demonstration of changed circumstances that are both significant and relevant to the child's welfare. Judge Harrison then addressed the entire courtroom, his voice carrying an almost professorial tone. I want to make a statement for the record, for any appeals that may follow, and for my own judicial clarity. Family law decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are made with full awareness of the human consequences they carry. This morning, I was prepared to weigh this case primarily through financial metrics and employment documentation. This afternoon, a 3-year-old child reminded me that the law must account for what is real and true about human relationships. He paused, his eyes glistening slightly. Sophie's 2 words, "good boy, Mama," were more honest and illuminating than hours of expert testimony. They demonstrated a child who feels safe, loved, and secure. No financial advantage could improve upon that foundation. Any custody arrangement that disrupted that security would not serve this child's best interests, regardless of the material resources offered. Judge Harrison set down his papers. The court finds that is a fit and capable parent who has provided her daughter with secure attachment and loving care, despite extraordinary personal challenges. The ruling of this court reflects a commitment to prioritizing children's emotional alongside material considerations. He looked at one final time. "Mrs., you have demonstrated courage, commitment, and love for your daughter in the face of significant adversity. The court recognizes your efforts and affirms your custody arrangement." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Couldn't breathe. Sophie, sensing her mother's emotion, wrapped her small arms around his neck. Tears streamed down his face, tears of relief, gratitude, vindication, and overwhelming love for her daughter. She looked across the courtroom toward Officer and Buddy. The officer was smiling, and Buddy's tail was wagging gently, as if the dog understood that justice had been served, that love had triumphed, that a family would remain intact. Held Sophie close and whispered into her daughter's hair, "We get to stay together, baby. We get to stay together." Sophie giggled, completely unaware of how completely her mother's world had just been saved. 3 weeks after the ruling, was sitting at her new desk at Tech Venture Solutions, a rapidly growing software development company in Hartford. She still couldn't quite believe this was happening. After 7 months of unemployment, after being told she was too old, too out of practice, too depressed to be valuable to employers, she now had a job. Not just any job, a position as a junior developer with a starting salary of $52,000 annually, which felt like an absolute fortune compared to her recent financial desperation. The job had come through an unexpected channel. A nonprofit called Second Chances at Work had been following the media coverage of his custody hearing. The organization specifically worked to help economically disadvantaged parents secure employment and career advancement. They'd seen the news story, recognized the situation, and reached out with an offer: a fully funded job training program in web development, 8 weeks of intensive instruction, followed by guaranteed job placement interviews with their partner companies. Had completed the program in record time, absorbing knowledge with the intensity of someone who understood that this opportunity was literally life or death important. Her instructors had noted her exceptional dedication and quick learning curve. Tech Venture Solutions had hired her directly from the program, impressed by both her technical capabilities and her personal story. They wanted to be known as a company that believed in second chances, that invested in people facing hardship. Had become not just an employee, but a symbol of their corporate values. But the professional transformation was only part of the story. The media coverage of her custody hearing had become unexpectedly massive. A journalist named No Relation To or her ex-husband had written an article for the Hartford Courant about the case titled, "3 Words That Changed Everything: When Love Trumped Financial Arguments in a Custody Battle." The article had been picked up by regional news outlets, then national human interest news sites, then social media. Within 2 weeks, the story had been viewed by over 2 million people online. News stations had contacted for interviews. She'd appeared on 3 local television programs and 1 national morning show. Producers loved the story. It had everything: drama, emotion, an underdog mother, a sympathetic child, and a dog with impeccable timing. The narrative was compelling and emotionally resonant. Parents watching the story recognized their own struggles in its face. People battling depression found hope in her vulnerability. Individuals facing economic hardship saw their own stories reflected in her desperation. Social media accounts had exploded. She'd never been particularly active on Instagram or Facebook before, but now she had thousands of followers. People shared their own stories in her comments: parents who'd struggled with mental illness and custody battles, individuals who'd faced employment discrimination, people who felt judged by society for their economic circumstances or health challenges. The most surprising response came from within the judicial system itself. Judge Harrison had begun receiving letters and emails from other judges, lawyers, and family law professionals expressing how the case had affected their perspective. One judge from New Hampshire wrote, "Your ruling and your honest acknowledgement of how your thinking had been limited by financial metrics has changed how I approach custody decisions. I've been prioritizing the wrong criteria. Thank you for the wake-up call." State bar associations began inviting Judge Harrison to speak at conferences about family law and attachment theory. He accepted several invitations, using his platform to advocate for more humanistic approaches to custody decisions. He spoke about how legal training often prioritized procedure and documentation over human reality. He spoke about Sophie's 2 words and how they taught him more about child development than 30 years of case law. Officer and K-9 Buddy had also become minor celebrities. Requests for the courthouse support dog program tripled after the story spread. Law enforcement agencies across the country contacted asking for guidance on implementing similar programs. He began consulting with court systems nationwide, helping establish emotional support dog programs in various jurisdictions. Buddy appeared on local news segments, and a feature article about the dog's work was published in a national pet magazine. Attended a panel discussion at the courthouse 1 month after her ruling. The panel included Judge Harrison, family law attorneys, child psychologists, and social workers. The topic was Beyond Financial Metrics: Holistic Approaches to Family Law. Sat among experts, nervous about her lack of formal training, but she'd been invited specifically because her personal story illustrated the gap between legal criteria and human reality. When it came time for her to speak, she was honest about her experience. "I felt like the system was designed to measure me and find me inadequate," she explained to the audience. "I was unemployed, depressed, poor, and living in a deteriorating apartment, All of those things were true, and all of them were temporary circumstances I was actively working to change. But the system seemed to interpret those temporary circumstances as permanent character flaws. She paused, collecting her emotions. What I want people to understand is that parents facing hardship are not bad parents. People managing mental illness are not unfit caregivers. Economic difficulty doesn't erase a parent's love or capability. Sophie didn't love me less because I was depressed or unemployed. She loved me completely, and when given the opportunity to express that love, she did so with devastating clarity. Look directly at the family law professionals in the audience. Your decisions affect real people, real children, real families. I urge you to look beyond the documentation and ask yourselves, what does this child actually need? Not what does this child deserve financially or materially, but what does this child's emotional development require? Often, the answer is simpler than we make it in legal proceedings. Children need to feel safe. Children need to feel loved. Children need to know their primary attachment figures will not be arbitrarily removed. The audience was silent, moved by her testimony. When she finished, there was spontaneous applause, something rarely seen in professional legal forums. Judge Harrison spoke after, referencing her comments. Mrs. has articulated something I've been struggling to understand since that afternoon in my courtroom. The law often operates as if children are abstract entities with measurable needs. But children are human beings with emotional requirements that can't be in a spreadsheet. We have failed our children when we reduce them to financial metrics and employment status. He looked directly at the other judges in the audience. I'm asking my colleagues to consider whether we've been prioritizing the wrong criteria in family law. I'm asking you to examine whether your decisions reflect what actually serves children's emotional development, or whether they simply reflect what's easiest to measure and defend legally. I'm asking you to consider whether love, when it's real and demonstrated, deserves greater weight in our judicial reasoning. The panel discussion led to the development of a new initiative called the Sophie Family Law Standards, a set of recommendations for incorporating attachment theory and emotional into custody decisions. The recommendations weren't legally binding, but they carried significant weight within the legal community. Judges who adopted the standards publicly were recognized as leaders in progressive family law thinking. Life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. She had stable employment with benefits that included excellent mental health coverage. She and Sophie had moved to a nicer apartment in a safer neighborhood. She'd caught up on her rent and was beginning to build savings again. Most importantly, she had vindication and validation. The system had recognized her as a good mother, not despite her struggles, but with full acknowledgement of them. Sophie had become something of a minor celebrity herself, though carefully shielded her daughter from too much media attention. The little girl didn't understand the significance of what she'd said that day in the courtroom. She simply knew that she got to stay with her mama, that she had weekly visits with her father that she sometimes enjoyed, and that there was a good boy dog at the courthouse that she got to visit occasionally. Still kept in touch with Officer and Buddy. They'd formed an unexpected friendship, united by the experience of being part of something larger than themselves. Sent updates about Buddy's work, photos of the dog helping other children in court proceedings. Buddy had helped a 10-year-old testify in an abuse case, had comforted a traumatized 8-year-old witnessing parents' custody dispute, had provided quiet support to dozens of frightened children navigating the legal system. Every time thought about that afternoon in the courtroom, she felt overwhelming gratitude for Officer's wisdom in recognizing what Sophie needed, for Judge Harrison's willingness to question his own assumptions, for Buddy's perfect gentleness and emotional intelligence, and most of all, for Sophie's 2 words that had somehow shifted everything. Love, demonstrated clearly and innocently, had proven more powerful than any legal argument. Stood in the auditorium of the Hartford County Courthouse, watching as Sophie, now 5 years old, colored in a coloring book while waiting for the panel discussion to begin. Her daughter had grown so much in 2 years, taller, more articulate, more confident. Sophie still talked about Buddy occasionally, still got excited on the days when took her to visit the courthouse support dog program. But the conversation was matter of fact now, not tied to trauma or fear. The courtroom that had once terrified her was now just another place, familiar and neutral. The panel discussion today was titled Beyond the Bench: How Personal Stories Transform Legal Systems. Judge Harrison had retired 6 months earlier, but he'd agreed to participate in this final public discussion before stepping away from the judicial system. Had also been invited to speak, along with Officer, a child psychologist, and a family law attorney who'd been influenced by the Sophie standards. 2 years had passed since that day in the courtroom, but the case remained remarkably alive in public consciousness. Story had been featured in a law review article titled The Role of Emotional Evidence in Family Law Decision-Making. Graduate students were studying her case in family law seminars across the country. Legal scholars were citing Judge Harrison's ruling as a landmark decision that challenged traditional approaches to custody determination. More importantly, his personal life had flourished beyond her wildest expectations. She'd been promoted to senior developer at Tech Venture Solutions just 18 months after being hired. Her salary had nearly doubled. She and Sophie had moved to a beautiful home in a quiet suburb, a 3-bedroom house with a fenced yard where Sophie could play safely. Had adopted a rescue dog, a gentle mixed breed that Sophie had named Buddy Jr. in honor of the courthouse support dog. The mortgage was manageable, the mortgage company having been impressed by her stable employment and her remarkable personal story. More significantly, had become an advocate herself. She'd started a blog called When Love Matters More Than Credentials, where she wrote about parenting while struggling with mental health challenges, about fighting stigma associated with depression, about the importance of emotional attachment in childhood development. The blog had grown to have thousands of regular readers. Parents reached out constantly, sharing their own struggles, thanking for making them feel less alone. She'd also started volunteering with Second Chances at Work, the nonprofit that had literally transformed her life. She now mentored other parents facing economic hardship and employment challenges, offering practical guidance and emotional support. She spoke at job training programs about persistence, self-compassion, and believing in your own worth, even when systems seemed designed to prove you unworthy. Sophie's development had been remarkable. The little girl was thriving in kindergarten, socially confident, emotionally secure, academically advanced. Her teacher reported that Sophie was a natural leader, kind to other children, eager to learn. She had no behavioral issues, no signs of the trauma or anxiety that sometimes affected children of custody disputes. She was simply a happy, healthy, secure child. The visitation arrangement with had worked out surprisingly well. He visited Sophie every other weekend as ordered, and while he would never be a highly involved parent, he'd made genuine efforts to be present and engaged. He'd actually followed Judge Harrison's recommendation to take parenting classes focused on attachment theory. He'd even admitted to during one exchange that the judge's ruling had forced him to reconsider his priorities and perspectives. Had received a letter from Judge Harrison just a few weeks before his retirement. In it, he'd written, "Dear, I've decided to retire from the bench. After 37 years, I believe this is the right time. But before I step away, I wanted to thank you. The case of Sophie fundamentally changed how I approach justice. You and your daughter taught me that love, when it's real and demonstrated, deserves to be recognized as legal evidence. You taught me that law must serve humanity, not the other way around. You've made me a better judge, a more compassionate person, and I'm grateful. I hope you know that the impact of that day in my courtroom extends far beyond your family. You've influenced how hundreds of judges now approach family law. Sophie's 2 words changed more than your custody arrangement. They changed the legal system itself. With deep respect and admiration, Judge Robert Harrison." Now, sitting in the auditorium, watched as the panelists took their seats. Judge Harrison, looking relaxed and more human than she'd ever seen him in official capacity, settled into his chair. Officer sat beside him, and Buddy was actually present in the courtroom, a special exception made for this discussion. The dog wore his official support animal vest and sat calmly at its feet, occasionally looking around as if understanding the significance of the moment. The moderator began with a question to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, as you retire, how do you reflect on the evolution of your thinking about family law over the past 2 years?" Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and spoke thoughtfully. "I spent 36 years making decisions based primarily on measurable criteria: income, employment status, financial resources, living conditions. These things matter, certainly. But what I learned from Sophie is that they don't matter nearly as much as we in the legal system believed. A child's emotional security, their attachment to a capable primary caregiver, their demonstrated sense of safety and love, these things are far more important than any financial advantage." He paused, his voice becoming thicker with emotion. "I received thousands of letters after that case was decided. Parents facing custody disputes wrote to thank me for recognizing that struggling doesn't mean failing. People managing mental health challenges wrote to say they felt less judged, less ashamed. Other judges wrote to say that case had changed their entire approach to family law." That kind of impact in such a short time made me realize I'd been operating within a limited framework for most of my career. The moderator then turned to, "Mrs., you've become quite an advocate yourself. What do you want people to understand about parenting while facing economic hardship and mental health challenges?" Took a breath, glancing at Sophie, who was now watching the panel with interest. "I want people to understand that parents aren't failures because they struggle. I want judges, lawyers, and social workers to understand that a parent managing depression is not automatically unfit. A parent facing unemployment is not inherently incapable. An apartment with maintenance issues doesn't negate a parent's love or ability to provide emotional security." She looked directly at the audience. "But more broadly, I want us as a society to stop treating poverty and mental illness as moral failings. When I walked into that courtroom, I felt like I was on trial not just as a mother, but as a human being. My depression was presented as a character flaw. My unemployment was presented as evidence of irresponsibility, but those things were circumstances I was actively working to change. They weren't who I was as a parent." His voice strengthened. "I was fortunate to have a judge who was willing to question his own assumptions and recognize that love matters. Not all parents are that fortunate. Many are fighting custody battles without a dog to break the tension, without a judge willing to reconsider his framework. I want systemic change. I want family law to be fundamentally reimagined to prioritize what children actually need: emotional security, safe attachment, and parents who love them, rather than what's easiest to measure." Officer was invited to speak about the support dog program. He explained how Buddy's work had expanded significantly since that fateful afternoon 2 years ago. "We now have support dog programs in 47 states," shared. "We have over 200 trained dogs working in court systems across the country. And while we can't guarantee that every interaction will lead to a life-changing moment like we witnessed with Sophie, we've seen countless instances where the dog's presence has helped children tell the truth, express their genuine emotions, and demonstrate their authentic attachment patterns." He looked at Buddy and the dog's tail wagged gently. "These dogs do something lawyers can't do. They offer unconditional acceptance without judgment. They help children access their truth when they're frightened and overwhelmed. They're not just comfort animals, they're facilitators of authentic evidence." As the discussion continued, reflected on how completely her life had transformed. 2 years ago, she'd been facing the loss of custody, living in a deteriorating apartment, unemployed and depressed, convinced she was failing her daughter. Now she was financially stable, professionally successful, emotionally healthier, and publicly recognized as a person whose story had changed systems. But more important than any of that was Sophie. Her daughter was happy, secure, confident, and thriving. Sophie knew she was loved unconditionally. She had no doubt about where she belonged or who she belonged with. She'd grown up understanding, at a very young age, that love was more important than money, that emotional connection trumped financial advantage, that a mother's devotion was valuable regardless of her employment status or mental health challenges. As the panel discussion concluded, Sophie got up and walked to the front of the auditorium. She looked at Buddy and smiled. "Hi, good boy," she said simply, the same words she'd said 2 years ago, now carrying the weight of transformation and triumph. Buddy's tail wagged, and Judge Harrison's eyes glistened with tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition that something truly important had occurred, that a simple moment between a child and a dog had fundamentally altered the trajectory of multiple lives and changed how an entire system approached justice. Love had won, not despite the complications and challenges, but through them, and because of them. Sophie's 2 words had created a legacy that would ripple forward for generations. Generations of children whose custody would be decided by judges who understood that attachment matters more than assets, that emotional security matters more than financial superiority, that a parent's love, demonstrated clearly and honestly, is the most important evidence any court could ever consider. The story of and Sophie would continue to be told in law schools, in courtrooms, in homes of struggling parents, and in the hearts of everyone who understood that sometimes the most profound truths about justice and human value can be expressed in just 2 simple words spoken by a 3-year-old girl who understood, in her innocent wisdom, what really mattered.